All right, here we are. We're going to talk about the next institution in Unit 3. So we just did the Congress, and next is the presidency. And then our next lecture will be on the judiciary. So we'll kind of cover the three branches of government here. All right, so we'll talk about, what did the framers think here? So what did the framers want? They wanted a president who could sort of rise to the demand of an emergency and act quickly during times of national crisis. So if you think back to the beginning of the semester, we talked a little bit about the Revolutionary War and the Articles of Confederation. And under the Articles, there really wasn't an executive, right? So there wasn't one person who could potentially solve a problem quickly. Under the Articles, you did everything by committee. Every time a committee has to act, you need compromise, and it takes more time. So they wanted someone who could act quickly if possible. So this could be a war. We could think today to the coronavirus, so a pandemic, like a medical condition that requires a quick response. You could also think of maybe something that happens like a tornado or a hurricane that needs a national response. So they wanted someone who had, and they would talk about having the energy to respond during times of national crisis. So you could coordinate collective action, right? So the government is large. Having one person coordinating all the action of the government makes things sometimes easier to do, right? So maybe instead of having a 50-state response, we could have one national response where people are responsive to the executive. So this collective action is having lots of people sort of act moving in the same direction. So it's easier to solve this problem if you have one person in charge. But at the same time, you don't want to make the executive, the president, all powerful. So you want to avoid a president who would sort of take advantage of any powers that allows the president to act in an emergency and use them what we would call sort of under like regular times. So, the framers, their idea was the legislative branch would be the most powerful branch. They would be the ones that set policy, write laws. And the president, really is sort of maybe a chief bureaucrat. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But that's sort of day to day. But again, in times of emergency, the president would sort of be able to take care of things. So it's hard to strike a balance to maybe provide temporary advantage. You could say, well, only under emergencies, but then you have to define emergencies. Current President Trump and previous presidents have, sort of defined things as an emergency to maybe institute a tariff or do something else. So you need to strike this balance between all powerful, but powerful enough to act when needed. And so a lot of the not using powers that are potentially there is based off of norms. So a norm is not a law. It's not even a rule. It's just sort of, well, you're not supposed to do that because it's bad. Right? We agree that you won't do those things, but there's nothing really stopping someone from doing those things. And so presidents have to think like, are they willing to break norms? And lots of presidents are. And as one president breaks the norm, the next presidents after them, it's less a breaking of a norm of like, hey, the last guy did it that way. It's okay for me to do it this way. So this norm-based system holding things together doesn't always work, right? It's not the same as laws or sort of things that are embedded within the Constitution. So what does the Constitution say? Of course, the president's duties and authority, it's found in Article 2. We talked about this a fair amount in the Constitution lecture. It basically lays out 4 roles of the president. So the first is commander-in-chief, right? And so the president is the head of the armed services in the military. The president is both a chief diplomat and head of state, and each of these will go into more detail in the next few slides. The president is chief executive, so this is the head of the bureaucracy. And then the president has some role as legislator. So I should say, like, this would make a good short answer question, right? What are the 4 roles of the president? Like, list and define the 4 roles of the presidency as discussed in the lecture. So some of the constitutional powers are ambiguous and limited. Some are very strict, right? So like the ability to veto, right? This is one of the powers as the legislator, are very well defined. But other powers, executive authority shall be vested in the executive branch, right? That's sort of vague. So some of the powers are ambiguous and limited, but the president is quite powerful, right? So, if I were to ask people, what is the, who is the most powerful person in the government, 90% of the people would say the president. It's not the same to say the same as what's the most powerful branch, but the most powerful individual is probably the president. And we'll get into some reasons why that's true. A lot of the power the president has, so there is some that's taken through norms, right? So kind of the norms are more like powers the president doesn't have, but the powers the president does have, some are in the Constitution, but a lot of the authority comes from laws where Congress delegates particular authority or rulemaking ability to the executive branch. So Congress might want to pass a law. The law doesn't always lay out everything that's going to happen, right? You can't know like what are all the things that the executive is going to have to do to enforce this law. So sometimes there are things that say, well, the executive branch can decide. I don't know. The classic example here is usually clean water. So the Clean Water Act kind of says, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is part of the executive branch, will make sure we have clean water. It's not really what it says, something like that. But it doesn't define what is clean water. And so it's up to the EPA, again, part of the executive branch, to define what is clean water, and different EPAs can make different definitions there. So again, a lot of sort of discretion is given to the executive branch. And then at the end of the day, it's the president usually that gets to decide these things. Now, it might be like some bureaucrat in the executive agency that sort of says, well, we're going to do this. But if the president says, no, we're not doing that, then they have to sort of listen to the president. So again, a lot of the sort of power of the presidency lies in the Congress delegating authority to the executive branch. And I don't know how much we'll get into this, but over time, the presidency, part of the reason the presidency has grown powerful is resources. So the executive branch, the budget for the executive branch is really large. There's lots of people, there's lots of information within the executive branch. Whereas the legislative branch, sort of, it's not as well staffed, the budget is less. And so the executive branch can sort of swamp the legislative branch in terms of expertise, right? All these things that the legislative branch just doesn't have. If you've ever been in a congressional office, like maybe each member has 6 to 8 staff members in DC, and then maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 back in the district. It's pretty small staff. And the staff arguably is actually like pretty underpaid. The chief of staff does pretty well, but lots of the people who are staffing a member of Congress are, recent graduates. Part of that is like it pays pretty bad. So, it's something you could do maybe when you're young and you don't have a lot of bills and responsibilities, but it's much harder to do. If you want to own a house in DC, being a low-level staffer isn't going to cut it. You need to make more money. So Congress has delegated authority, and then over time, the executive branch has grown powerful through this authority, but also through sort of just the bigness of the bureaucracy. So the different roles, the president is commander-in-chief, right? Here's President Trump, addressing the military. Here's Obama addressing the military. Now, the military itself is not supposed to be political, but presidents like using the military essentially as a political prop. And it happens all the time. Sometimes the members of the military don't really have a say. There are some rules about attending presidential rallies in uniform. Now, in this case, so I think this for Obama, this is the Joint Chief of Staff, so they're there for some, I don't know, Obama asked them to be there. And then Trump is addressing probably in front of him, or probably more members of the military, and some are behind him. So it's not really a rally, but like it kind of is. And the military here, they have no say in the matter. So again, commander-in-chief of the nation's armed forces, but the president is a civilian. So the highest generals or whatever their rank is, they report to the president, who's a civilian. So it's a civilian-led military rather than a military-led military. The founders sort of grappled with, do we want one person to have control over the military, right? So we do have a tradition in the U.S. where the military, and the National Guard is a little different, but the military acting under command of the commander-in-chief is basically an international force, not something that enforces laws of the state. That's for the police or various. Again, the National Guard gets a little complicated, and if we think back to some of the protests we had maybe a couple months ago now, the National Guard acting under the governor is okay, but acting under the president is a little different. So again, the founders sort of grappled with giving one person control of the military. So they sort of divided control by said, okay, the president is commander-in-chief, but only the Congress can declare war. Unfortunately, there's a big difference between war and the military doing something, right? So where's a military base going to go? That's not war. So maybe the executive branch can decide that. Shooting a couple, missiles into a country, is that war? I don't know. So it's sort of a hollow check. And because the commander-in-chief sort of has these first mover advantage, right? So the president can commit troops to a situation. This is under the War Powers Act. So this came out sort of in the wake of Vietnam. So the president can commit troops and then has 48 hours to sort of inform Congress, what's going on. And then the operation must end within 60 days unless Congress approves an extension. But if you have troops who are committed, it's going to be hard for the Congress to say well, nope, you got to bring them back now, right? So usually when the president commits troops, right, there's this feeling of patriotism in the country, and so it gets complicated on bringing troops back. We've also operated on, for actually most of your lifetimes under a situation where we're sort of on this war on terror, and so it's a very vaguely defined idea of what can the president do without sort of needing help from Congress. Now, sort of the big power that Congress has is the power of the purse, and so they could potentially defund the military in certain ways. But that's, again, it's seen as unpatriotic. And then if you want to dig a little deeper, a lot of the way the military is funded is there's a little bit here, so Oklahoma has military bases, Texas has military bases, California has military bases, Maryland has military bases, or maybe, they're going to make an airplane. Well, they might make one part in this state, another part in this state. So politicians have a clear incentive to keep funding the military at these high rates, because lots of politicians have something about the military back in their districts. So again, in theory, Congress could lower spending for the military, but that usually means the members themselves are taking a hit in their district or their state. So again, the president has this first mover advantage here, and Congress would have to act in what would look like generally an unpatriotic way, which is hard to do. The president is head of state. And so what this means is this is really dealing with international issues. So either international issues overseas or things that are international that are happening back home, like a visit by someone from out of the country to the US, so, another head of state, a prime minister or a queen or someone coming to the US. So the executive branch has pretty broad authority dealing with diplomatic affairs, right? The president can appoint ambassadors, although they're supposed to be approved by the Senate. A lot of ambassadors are appointed because of things they've maybe helped the president with. This is sort of the easy ones, ambassador to France, right? It's kind of a cushy job. Some of the harder ambassador positions are people who have more experience in that position. So anyways, the framers said, okay, the Congress will deal with these domestic issues for the most part, and the president and the executive branch is more authority to things happening internationally. And again, this sort of like trying to deal with these international things under the articles, like just didn't work out as well because you have a committee rather than one individual. So if you're trying to bargain with a country, having one person have the authority to bargain might make it easier. Now, treaties, and we'll get to this, need to have the approval by the Senate, although there's lots of ways around that. So there's a check. George Washington, first president, he said this idea about receiving ambassadors, right? So ambassadors would come to the US and then be formally received by the president, is essentially recognizing that a country exists. So for the most part, like, all right, that doesn't really matter. But there are some questions, right? Like questions about China, questions about Israel, right? So some countries don't agree that Israel exists as a country. By the US receiving an ambassador from Israel is sending a signal to the world like, okay, this is a country. Or you might have a country where there's dueling, it's not clear who's in charge. And so who the president recognizes there sends a signal. When it comes to negotiations, the head of state, so it's not always the president, could be acting through the Secretary of State or some other agency, but the head of state is this focal point for negotiations, or the executive branch is the focal point. What we don't want is people sort of having what we call rogue diplomacy. So here's President Obama, I think recognizing someone from Japan. I don't know. This is obviously a fake, partly fake picture. President Trump is in the Middle East with this orb here. Like, you had to know they were going to Photoshop. This is actually a real picture, right? So, this rogue diplomacy, I don't really know. But hey, rarely do Americans get to talk to the ruler of North Korea. So there it is. So I mentioned treaties. So the president might negotiate a treaty with another country, and that needs to be ratified by the Senate with a 2/3 majority. So it needs a supermajority. And there's sort of an example. The Senate rejected the League of Nations, which is kind of like a precursor to the United Nations. But in reality, presidents can use what's called executive agreements, which is kind of like an executive order that has the force of law. Now, there's some times when you still need treaties, and sometimes the executive agreements will work. The executive agreements don't need the ratification. That's the key difference here. The Congress could say, could try to pass a law disagreeing with the executive agreement, and that's allowed. But rather than having to ratify, the executive agreement is in force unless it's rejected. A treaty is not in force unless it's ratified. So they sort of act in opposite ways. And then, of course, if the Congress tries to pass a law overriding an executive agreement, if the president can veto that legislation. So I'll admit, I don't really know the intricacies of when an executive agreement is okay and when the treaty is needed. I think some of these trade agreements we had needed a congressional approval, and then some other things don't. Okay, so the president is chief executive, and this means the head of the bureaucracy. So the bureaucracy is vast, right? All these departments, Department of Agriculture, Department of Education. We have the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, the CDC, Department of Defense, so that is a little different because that sort of falls under the military. But there's lots and lots of bureaucratic agencies that sort of enforce our laws to some extent. And the president is the top. The president nominates people to be the head of its cabinet position, the head of the agency, and that needs to be approved by the Senate. And now actually you can't filibuster that, so it's easier to get approval. President Trump liked to appoint interim heads of these agencies, and you don't have to go through the process, although there's sort of a time limit on how long you can be the interim or acting head of an agency. So the executive authority derives from the Constitution. The executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States of America. but it really doesn't define this explicitly. So, if you remember back to the Constitution lecture, Article 1 dealing with the Congress, define things very explicitly in some ways. But Article 2, the presidency or the executive branch is like, it's much less explicit about powers. I think part of this is the founders were like, well, the legislative branch, of course, will be the most important one, so we'll spend a lot of time on that, and the executive won't be that important, so we don't have to spend as much time and detail on that. Article 2, Section 2 says the executive can make appointments with the advice and consent. So this is approval from the Senate, and this is kind of vague, right? It doesn't say the Senate has to vote on an appointment or a nomination, right? So think back to Obama was able to nominate a justice, and the Senate said, we're not voting on it. So it doesn't say the Senate has to vote, rather the Senate, sort of can vote. It doesn't say how much advice and consent the Senate, the president has to listen to. So basically the only thing that matters is the vote. Talks a little bit about recess appointments. So if Congress is not in session and there needs to be an appointment made, the president is allowed to make an appointment. So, if the Senate wants to stop the executive from doing that, they have what's called a pro forma session where someone just gavels in and gavels out. President Obama basically said those don't count and tried to make recess appointments when the Senate the Senate was like, we were in session, and the president said, no, you weren't. This actually went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, look, the Senate gets to define when they're in session, the executive can't. I think it's basically if every 3 days you sort of gavel in and gavel out. And what I mean is someone just says we're in session. Okay, now we're out of session, and that's it. So there was controversy under the Obama administration about these recess appointments. And then they said, this person who was appointed sort of not constitutionally under a recess appointment isn't really the head of the agency. So the Senate might try to avoid recess appointments. There's the take care clause. It says to take care that laws are faithfully executed. Again, this is kind of poorly defined. What does this mean to faithfully execute a law? Can the president ignore something? Now, it's kind of hard for the president if there's a law that says, the government shall spend money on this particular thing, the president can't impound that money and not spend it. But there's lots of other laws that are much more vague about what the president is supposed to do. So one example is, in the Department of Justice, what cases are they going to spend time on and what cases are they going to not spend time on? So under the Obama administration, they basically said thinking about immigration, if someone is here, overstayed their visa or is not here in agreement with the laws, the president can say ignore these cases, right? So ignore cases where someone was brought to the country when they were a child and don't sort of prosecute that case. But, there might be the case where someone came to the country and broke a different law, right? Say okay, in that case, prosecute that case. I think other examples are, with marijuana, right? Marijuana is illegal according to federal law, but the president can direct the Department of Justice, just ignore, what's going on in the states. So there's a lot of leeway here in this position. So one way the president can control the executive branch is through executive orders. And so these are formal instructions from the president to manage the government. So and different presidents use these at different rates. It was much more used by FDR during the Depression and World War II than presidents do today. But again, this is sort of formal instruction from the president to manage the government. So that the president is head of the executive branch and can write instructions to the executive branch on how to operate. So this essentially has the force of law until the president or a successor can retract it. Congress can nullify it, but that has to have approval from the president, or it's ruled unconstitutional. And so these can be pretty powerful. And so the president has broad discretion on telling the executive branch, all these agencies, on how to act. Some examples, some are not as important, but so directions to the military on how to mourn, the death of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, who, if you recall, died on the 4th of July, 50 years the day after the signing of the Declaration, and basically at the same time. So here's instructions how to mourn that. But they could be much more broad-reaching, right? So Japanese internment during World War II was an executive order. So it's not a law, it was an executive order. Having sanctions on North Korea can be done via executive order. So, we kind of lump all these things in together as executive orders, but there's other ways, like you have directives or memorandums to the bureaucracy, and they, at this level, kind of get lumped in. But the important thing is, like, the president has the ability to tell the executive branch how to act. And so DACA, the Deferred Action Plan for Immigration, was an executive order, so it wasn't a law. And so this has gone back and forth in the courts about the power of this. So again, this is sort of telling the bureaucracy, like, people in this particular situation, you're allowed to stay in the country, and we're not going to prosecute that case. And it sort of gave a little bit more legality to it, although I'm careful here not to say like it was a law, but maybe put some more bureaucracy behind it. The president has a role as a legislator. The Constitution gives a very modest one. So this is the veto. Congress can call the Congress into special session. And then it says the executive has to report from time to time to Congress with a State of the Union address. And it doesn't have to be a like televised address or a formal speech. It actually could be a written document. And so Jefferson and many presidents, until we got into more modern media times, actually just wrote a report and gave it to Congress. But now this is a big to-do with the State of the Union, lots of TV, lots of attention to it. So the way the president can influence the legislative process is really through trying to move public opinion. And so the president has an agenda, using the State of the Union address or other means, can try to pressure the Congress into acting. So we say the president goes public, right? They give a speech on a particular thing and they tell people, hey, pressure your members of Congress to do this or that. Or members of Congress would be like, wow, the president talked about that, and they did a poll and an approval for that particular thing is like really high. So I guess we'll do this thing the president wants. Right now, lots of policy is like divided. So, and obviously we live in very polarized times, and the Democrats aren't going to do anything that President Trump wants. Even if it's in their best interest, they might not do it because they don't want to give a win to the other side. And, obviously, like, the Republicans did this under President Obama. I picture the same thing no matter who's president next. So I said this, you use the State of the Union, you go public to try to set the agenda. So here's Obama during a State of the Union address, right? And say, they give a copy of the speech to the media beforehand, and they go through like, here's the things that are important, right? Middle-class tax breaks, taxing the rich, community college plan, sick leave, cybersecurity, right? These are the things that Obama says are important, but has no way guarantees the legislature is going to work on them, right? So there's Boehner when he was speaker, and he's probably like, nope, not doing any of those things, right? Maybe the tax breaks, because maybe they'll do those, but the legislative branch gets to decide, do they want to act on these things or not? There's Trump giving one of the State of the Unions, and Nancy Pelosi has her famous clapback on Trump here. I don't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing, but it certainly went viral there. Then she tore up the speech afterwards, which probably wasn't the best thing to do, but she did it anyways. One thing it did is it diverted attention from whatever the president talked about to people are talking about tearing up the speech. And so can you win sort of that media cycle? And perhaps by tearing up the speech, you help win the media cycle. Fewer people are watching the State of the Union addresses than they used to. And you probably get more people generally watch the first State of the Union. So the first for Clinton. It was different for Bush. His most watched was the one after the Iraq invasion. This sort of a little strange. Obama, first one, and Trump, held kind of steady for the first three and then declined. So what this means is like people aren't paying attention. If you're trying to drive policy through the media, through going public, if people aren't watching, then it doesn't work as well. I should say the eyeball is like, this is very partisan driven. So, and this matches probably some other figures. If you think way back to the beginning, we talked about polarization, I think some. So under Clinton, a few more Democrats watched than Republicans, but it wasn't that different. But under George W. Bush, we begin to see like way more Republicans and Democrats watching. Then Obama becomes president and it flips. Then under Trump, it sort of flips back around again. So, like so much of what's happening, it's polarization and partisanship is driving behavior. It's not like, Democrats all of a sudden are much more interested in what the president has to say. Democrats under Obama are interested in what Obama has to say, and Republicans are like, I can't watch that. And you got sort of vice versa. So over time, the role and the power and authority of the power of the presidency has changed. So, up until 1900s or so, presidents, were sort of not as powerful. Their role in the government was less. You had some senators were extremely powerful. I actually think like the cabinet itself was probably more powerful. Like Secretary of State was not more powerful than the president, but like was seen almost not quite as an equal as the president, but pretty close. So up until 1900 or so, the president assumed a smaller role. And then over time, sort of government expanded, and so did the workload of the president, right? So sort of through the Depression, the government expanded by a lot, and then World War II, so both the military, but then like all these executive branch agencies were created. So this became more work, but also more power, right? And I talked earlier how as the size of government grows, it becomes more power in the executive branch because there's just more people, there's more information. The legislative branch basically can't keep up with what's going on. So as government expanded, so did the workload of the president, but so did the power of the president. So, Congress can't keep up. What do? They delegate authority to the White House. So, it wasn't as much the president taking power, but Congress just giving it away. Some of this was you sort of had, especially through Roosevelt, you had a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president. And so they're like, oh, yeah, we'll give Roosevelt the power. It's fine. But not, I don't know if they weren't thinking about long term, but politics is usually short term. Politicians usually think in short term. Hey, can we get a short term advantage here? Let's go for it. So a lot of changes in our government were based off of trying to solve a short term problem, but maybe had long term consequences. So again, like the executive just gained lots of discretion in hiring and administering lots of programs. And so Congress just has a hard time keeping up. We'd say this is monitoring the executive branch, right? Like there's different ways to think about how you monitor the executive branch. The analogy we use is police patrol versus fire alarms. So police patrol, if police patrol monitoring would be sort of driving around looking for problems, right? Say like, hey, like let's have a hearing. Let's sort of see what's going on in this part of the executive branch. And like, oh, look, we discovered a problem. That's police patrol. It takes a lot of work. The other way to do it is fire alarm. And so, you think about the fire stations, right? So the firefighters, they sit in the fire station until someone pulls an alarm, and then they go out and fight the fire. So under fire alarm, the legislative branch kind of waits till there's a problem, and then they react. And so Congress probably operates more under this fire alarm way of monitoring the executive branch than police patrol. So less going out looking for problems and more like being alerted and figuring out, oh, we have to do something. And again, this has to do with like, there's just not enough staff, I don't think, in the executive branch to do these things. That and like, members are constantly spending their time raising money and running for re-election. Could think a little bit about sort of unified versus divided government. So unified government is when the same party controls the presidency and both chambers in the legislative branch. Divided government is when the president and one chamber of the executive branch is a different party. So, there's studies on like, is it easier to pass legislation under unified government? Like, and the answer is like, it kind of depends. Probably, the last decade or so, this is probably true. Over the long haul, like it's not necessarily true. Sometimes divided government, maybe you need some more compromise, but you have to be willing to compromise. In the last decade, at least, like no one's been willing to compromise. So, you might be able to pass big legislation now under unified government, and it's just harder to do under the divided government. So, the New Deal, Great Society, healthcare reform, these are all passed under unified democratic control. Maybe some tax cuts are passed under unified Republican control. So yeah, it's just trying to deal with the other party under divided government gets difficult because you have to be willing to. So the president has to be willing to compromise, and then the opposite party in the legislative branch has to be willing to give the president a win. And so it's usually seen as a win by the president rather than sort of compromise or a win by the legislative branch. And so the legislative branch, if they're the opposite party, don't want to give the president a win because that increases the president's chance of re-election. It doesn't really help re-election chances for the members in the House or the Senate. However, it might solve like a real policy problem. And so that's an issue we have to deal with is you have these electoral incentives and they might differ from solving actual policy problems. So that's what I talked about. That. So what can presidents do here? Like they can try to negotiate. And so, actually, I think the recent example of the trying to pass another round of stimulus for COVID. So there's an initial like huge bill, right? Everyone's like, pile in the money. All right, spend, and they have a huge bill. And then there's like, all right, we need another round. And there's some negotiations. Democrats wanted a big number. The Republicans wanted a smaller number. And then at some point, Trump was like, that's it, we're out. We're not negotiating anymore. And then the stock market tanked like that afternoon. And president's like, oh, wait, never mind, back to the table. And so, what can presidents do is they're going to have to give up, right? And then maybe give the other party a win, but it gets complicated. So the Democrats right now have an incentive. So it's I'm talking a couple weeks into October here to like maybe wait until after the election to pass a stimulus bill. Again, because they don't want to give the president a win. For the most part, like giving people money is a win. People like that. They worry later about like, oh no, the debt's too high. But it's seen as a win. So you have to be willing to negotiate, willing to compromise, and some presidents are and some presidents aren't. And it's the same thing on the legislative side. Sometimes they compromise and sometimes they won't. So the president is a strategic actor. If you want to be a successful president, you need both opportunity and skill. And some presidents are better at some things than others. President Trump is really good at exciting his base, and by going public. Right now, it's at the same time he sort of turns off a certain segment of the population, but has been really good at getting his base excited, and then the base is pressuring senators and members of the House of his party to work with the president. Maybe kind of take a careful look at the Trump presidency. The Republicans have sort of gone against stances that they were in favor of before. So tax cut that drives up, so in favor of tax cut, that really drives up the deficit and the debt. And then the other one is like parties have sort of flipped on like free trade. It's not quite that clear, but the Republicans were pretty clearly the party of free trade, and President Trump is against that for the most part. And members of his party in the House and Senate have gone along with him. I think President Trump is probably less skillful at, in some ways, at manipulating the executive branch. It's not great at negotiating with Congress either, I don't think. There's not really attention to detail there. Obama was also good about going public, and actually not so great with negotiating with Congress. I don't know. So sort of depends on the person. So, sort of how presidents use the resources, veto threats, these sorts of things. can sort of make the difference. But there's just sort of this like luck factor, right? Like, before the coronavirus, like what were the chances of Trump getting reelected? They're certainly much better, but sort of this big health crisis hits, and I think the president could have done a better job of responding to it. But like the fact that the virus hit, like, is kind of just a thing that happened, right? It's not like the president made it happen. And so sort of how the presidents can respond to events that are outside of their control, it can influence their success, right? Are they seen as a good president or a bad president? And so you do need some skill as a politician. I've actually seen some interesting things about like, is Trump a good politician? Like, yes, but maybe he got lucky. Right? When he ran in 2016, like Hillary Clinton's favorables were very low. Lots of people didn't like her. Like maybe it could have been anyone, right? I mean, he won, so he did something right. But there's questions of like, did he get lucky, or was it skill, or what? And I'm sure it was a combination of both. So the executive, we look to him as a leader, but the power. I think the power and authority of the president has probably grown much more than the founders wanted originally. So that's it. There's the executive branch. We'll do the judiciary will be next.